Hello and welcome to my Muscles in Action lecture. Right now, before you begin, you should already know how the micro-physiology of muscle contraction works. That is how thick filaments and thin filaments work together to make the muscle contract, and how the various parts of the muscle work together to control muscle contraction. In review, skeletal muscles move or stabilize our skeleton and other body parts by shortening themselves, called contraction. A skeletal muscle organ is made up of many bundled skeletal muscle fibers. Which are each in turn made up of myofibrils, which use cross-bridge cycles in which the thick filaments pull on the thin filaments by forming cross bridges and then shortening those cross bridges to shorten themselves, which produces a contraction. Contraction is activated by a flood of calcium ions within the muscle fiber, which only happens when the muscle cell is stimulated by a motor neuron. Each muscle fiber contracts independently from all of the others. So we have to stimulate every single fiber that we want to contract. That's problem number one that we're going to try to solve in this. And each contraction is very short. And when I say very short, I mean it lasts less than a second, about 100 milliseconds. So we also have to stimulate each fiber many times to get a full-length contraction. So those are the two problems we're going to try to solve in the first part of this lecture, is how to get from a very short contraction to a long one, and how to get from a bunch of independent muscle fibers to a whole muscle contraction. But first, I want to review what you should already know about the microphysiology of muscle contraction. This all begins when the spinal cord sends a motor signal toward a muscle fiber. A motor nerve signal, which is called an action potential, reaches the end of the neuron, which is called either the axon terminal or the synaptic knob. Which is this thing right here. When the synaptic vesicle, when the action potential reaches the end of the synaptic knob, it causes these synaptic vesicles to release neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, or capital A, capital C, little h, acetylcholine, into the synaptic cleft, where it binds to receptors on the motor end plate of the muscle cell. An action potential then spreads along the sarcolemma, as you can see right there. And then as it continues along the sarcolemma, it also turns and heads down the T-tubules, or transverse tubules, into the muscle cell. Finally, the action potential triggers the sarcoplasmic reticulum, or SR, to release calcium ions. So those are sort of the control steps. That's how we get from the spinal cord wanting our muscle to contract to the on signal, calcium, being present in the muscle. But what happens? So we've just had the SR release calcium ions. These ions bind to troponin, which moves tropomyosin out of the way. Once tropomyosin is, and you can see that process there, once tropomyosin is out of the way, then the myosin heads can grab on to actin, and that forms what we call a cross bridge. The myosin heads then swivel, moving the thin filaments. See, the thin filament here is kind of lined up with the myosin. Here it's moved, it's shifted towards the M line, towards the middle of the thick filament. And as all of these thin filaments across the entire muscle shift towards their M lines, that causes the entire muscle to get noticeably shorter. At this point, we're stuck. We have a slightly shorter muscle, but we can't continue shortening it until we detach the myosin head and rewind it. So we need to use ATP to detach myosin from actin and to rewind and spring load the head back into its starting position so that we can keep repeating steps 6, 7, and 8 here. And as 6 and 7 and 8 repeat, the whole muscle fiber contracts. Now, what you may not have considered in studying all of those steps is what happens when we stop, when we want the action potential to stop, or when we want the muscle contraction to stop. As soon as the motor neuron stops sending action potentials, so no more action potentials, then we have no more acetylcholine released into the synaptic cleft. Okay, so no more acetylcholine there. The acetylcholine that's already there, though, still has a little bit of time before it goes away. And what happens is there's an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase that breaks down the acetylcholine molecules that are already there so that we don't have muscle contractions going on forever. If there's no acetylcholine, then the receptors on the motor end plate are no longer going to generate action potentials on the sarcolemma or down the T tubules. So no more of those action potentials there and there. If we don't have action potentials running down the T tubule opening the gates to let calcium out, then there's no more release of calcium. Instead, calcium is taken back up. So the calcium ions are taken back up into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and with no calcium there, without calcium ions, then troponin is deactivated, and its partner tropomyosin, the chaperone at the dance, moves back to its off position, which blocks the myosin heads from binding to actin. So if myosin can't bind to actin, then we can't go on to form a cross bridge, and so this whole cycle stops. So the whole cross bridge cycle stops, and ultimately the muscle fiber relaxes. Okay, so we now know how all the micro machines inside the cell, all the micro machinery causes a single action potential to translate into a single short contraction of the muscle fiber. But a single short twitch of a muscle fiber doesn't do much. So we have the question of how can we make longer and stronger muscle contractions? How can we get one muscle fiber to go longer and stronger? And also, how do we recruit, as they say, enough muscle fibers to get a job done? Because one individual muscle fiber isn't that strong, but we have lots of fibers in every muscle. Problem two, as you noticed, ATP is required to make the cross-bridge cycle work. There are other things in the muscle that require ATP as well. So how do we get all of that ATP to make the muscle contract? And also, what happens if those muscle fibers run out of fuel or oxygen or other stuff? And we'll also categorize different muscle fibers based on their speed or their endurance. Okay, so first, longer and stronger. Sounds like we're going to the Olympics here. Trying to get muscles to do something more than a wimpy little single twitch. Okay, so again, starting at the basics, one motor neuron signal leads to one muscle action potential. And this may seem kind of crazy if you look at the lower graph down here, but one single muscle action potential lasts about 1 to 2 milliseconds. So one motor neuron signal leads to one couple of millisecond action potential on the muscle cell. That really leads to one release of our old friend calcium, and one burst of calcium out into the cell leads to a short period of cross-bridge cycling, and that leads to a brief contraction. Look at the upper graph over here, and you'll see that when we talk about a brief contraction, the muscle starts building up strength, and then about 50 milliseconds in, the calcium starts getting sucked back up into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and we slack off on our contraction. So total time of a single, we call this a single twitch. That is actually the technical term for it. It's called a muscle twitch. And one twitch, as you can see from that upper graph, is very short. It's about 100 milliseconds. And in the 50 milliseconds that it has to build up before it starts to relax again, the muscle fiber doesn't have enough time to build up to its full strength. So we need a way to add twitches together. It turns out that there's only one way to stimulate a muscle, which is to send motor neuron action potentials to the muscle. But it turns out that there are three ways to space those action potentials apart that lead to three completely different results. The first, as you can see here, is that we stimulate once, get a single up and down. We stimulate again, we get a single up and down. We've let the muscle fiber relax completely, go all the way back down to zero before we re-stimulate. Any kind of contraction, a good example of that is if your muscle is shivering. It's producing tiny little twitch-like contractions that aren't strong enough to make any movement happen. These are what we call single twitches. So this is a single twitch contraction. Each twitch is completely separate from the next twitch because we let it relax completely before we re-stimulate. But what if we stimulate the muscle, it starts to build up force, and just as it's starting to relax, to let go, we stimulate it again, and so we build up a little bit more, and then we let it relax. In this case, we're adding the two twitches together to some extent. It's not a complete addition. We don't get twice the strength that we started with, but we're adding the twitches together, and so that's called twitch summation. We end up getting a slightly jerky muscle contraction because it goes up and a little down and then up again and down. But we end up with a muscle contraction that overall is both stronger, the relative strength is higher here than the single twitch, and it's considerably longer than either of the single twitches. So the question then becomes, what if we don't wait for the muscle contraction to start to peter off before we re-stimulate? What if we stimulate here, the muscle starts to build up, and then we stimulate immediately again, and we build up a little more, stimulate immediately again, build up a little more, and keep doing that until the muscle reaches the highest muscle tension that it can possibly get to. And at that point, the muscle fiber is considered entirely contracted. It's at its maximum strength, and that point is called either tetanus or tetany. I've seen it named either way. And despite the odd name, I mean, this sounds like a disease, right? Tetanus is something we get shots for. But this is the way we almost always use our muscles, is to rapidly stimulate them so that the muscles reach tetanus or tetany, as the case may be. Okay, so now we can make each muscle fiber give us a long and strong contraction. But why have this big muscle full of lots of muscle fibers? You know, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 muscle fibers in this tiny little muscle over here. Most muscle fibers have hundreds or thousands of muscle fibers. So why have that big muscle if we're only going to use one muscle fiber at a time? So in order to use more than one muscle fiber at a time, we need a way to stimulate, or the word musculologists use for this is recruit. We need to recruit more than one muscle fiber at a time. Now, we also need a way to dial in exactly the number of muscle fibers we want for a particular goal. So we don't ever want just one muscle fiber, but sometimes we want a few fibers to contract for a short time. So for example, if I'm erasing a whiteboard, I pick up my whiteboard eraser and I wipe it across the board. None of those activities lasts very long, and they don't take a lot of energy because the whiteboard eraser is very light. So I only need a few fibers. If I contracted my entire muscle to pick up the whiteboard eraser, I'd probably throw it all the way up into the ceiling. But sometimes we want to lift a heavy object, so we need many fibers to contract for a short time. For example, if I had a heavy object on the floor and I wanted to pick it up onto the table, I grab it, I exert almost my full muscle force to get it up off the ground onto the table, but then it's done. I didn't need those fibers for a long time. But then there are other cases where we're carrying something, it may not be terribly heavy, but we have to carry it for a long time. So we might need a few fibers at a time, but we need them to take turns so that they last a long time. An example of that would be carrying a kind of medium heavy grocery bag across the parking lot. At first it doesn't feel that heavy, but the further you go, the heavier it feels because some of your muscle fibers are starting to wear out, or fatigue, as they say. So we have to contract maybe all the pink fibers here for a short time, and then when they start to wear out, we can contract the tan fibers, and they can take turns, letting each set of muscle fibers recover a little bit. Now, the other issue here is that not just your muscles would get worn out, but your brain would get worn out pretty quickly if it had to keep calculating exactly which set of muscle fibers to stimulate each time. You know, which muscle fibers have I used, which ones need a rest, and which ones can I use again? You know, so it's easier to have preset groups of muscle fibers. So we can just say, oh, well, I need group 1 right now, and then I'll use group 2 later. Or I need a stronger contraction, so I'll add group 1 and group 2 together. And that's exactly the way the body approaches stimulating muscles. It stimulates a preset group of muscle fibers all at once. And we call those preset groups motor units. Okay. So an explanation of motor units and recruitment. The way the nervous system activates just the muscle fibers it wants is by mapping each motor neuron to one group of muscle fibers, and that group of muscle fibers, because they're all stimulated by the same motor neuron, is called a motor unit. Okay, so how does that work? Each motor neuron, let's take this little yellow one here, splits into 1, 2, 3 in this case, but into several branches just before it reaches the place where it will stimulate its muscle. All of the fibers stimulated by one particular motor neuron will contract at the same time. So if I stimulate motor neuron number 1 here, my signal travels all the way down to the end of motor neuron 1, and it stimulates this fiber and this fiber and this fiber all at the same time. That means that those muscle fibers will always contract as a unit. They will always contract together at the same time. Since they're one unit and they come from one motor neuron, we call that a motor unit. So we can now dial in the strength of a muscle contraction by choosing which motor units to activate, and therefore which muscle fibers we want to recruit. In the example shown here, unit 1, the one I've highlighted in red there, would stimulate 1, 2, 3 pale pink fibers. Unit 2 would stimulate 1, 2, 3 dark pink fibers. And unit 3 here would stimulate 1, 2 orange fibers. So if we assume each fiber has the same strength, we'll call it a strength of 1, then unit 1 has a strength of 3, unit 2 has a strength of 3, and unit 3 has a strength of 2. So what muscle strength could we dial in on this muscle? Well, the lowest strength we could dial in would be a 2. We could just activate unit 3. If we activated either unit 1 or 2, we would get a strength of 3. If we activated units 1 and 3 or 2 and 3, we could get 2 plus 3 equals 5. We could also stimulate units 1 and 2 at the same time, so 3 plus 3 equals 6. And then we could stimulate units 1, 2, and 3 all at the same time, so 2 plus 3 plus 3 is a full strength of 8. So you see we can't get quite every single possible number between 1 and 8, but we can get 2, 3, 5, 6, or 8. Those are that's a decent amount of control over how much this muscle contracts. If we wanted finer control, then what we do is we make a larger number of small motor units. So part A here, a good example of this would be the hand muscles have lots of small units, and what that does is you can get a lot of fine control over exactly how hard you squeeze your pencil, for example, when you're writing, by dialing in a little bit, a small motor unit, a lot of small motor units a little bit at a time. On the other hand, if we look at your arm muscles, we have fewer units, but they're very large units. And that's because you don't really need fine control over exactly how hard you move your arm. You just need to, you want to be able to very quickly activate enough strength in your arm to lift whatever it is. Maybe it's, if you're just lifting a whiteboard eraser, you just activate one motor unit. If you're lifting a average grocery bag, maybe you activate 3 motor units. And if you're going to the gym and you're lifting weights, then maybe you do a full strength contraction with even more motor units. Okay, one last word on how we use our muscles at the macro-physiology level. There are 2 ways to build up strength in a muscle, in a whole muscle. So one is called isometric. So iso means the same, and metric means length. A meter is a unit of length. So an isometric contraction contracts with the muscle at the same length. So why would we ever want to do that? Well, again, let's say you're carrying a grocery bag across the parking lot. Generally, you're not sitting there picking the grocery bag up and setting it down, up and down, up and down. You're carrying it at the same muscle length. Or let's say, somebody hands you a baby and you're holding that in your arms. You're not sitting there tossing and dropping, tossing and catching the baby over and over again. Maybe you are, but most of the time you're just sitting there holding the baby at the same length. But your muscles are still contracting. They're still exerting muscle tension, muscle force. And so that tension develops at a constant length. So that's one way to build up tension in a muscle, is to set a particular length and then build up enough tension to hold the grocery bag or the dumbbell or the baby at exactly that one spot. The other option is an isotonic contraction. Again, iso means same. Tonic here, tone is muscle tension. So this is one where you set the force of the muscle contraction, and if it's greater than the weight of whatever you're carrying, you lift the thing up. And if you can also have an isotonic contraction that is slowly setting something down. If you dial in your muscle tension to 10 pounds and you're holding a 12-pound object, then it's going to slowly sink down to the ground as your muscle, even as your muscle keeps trying to contract.